There's a question almost nobody asks out loud because it feels almost forbidden to ask it, especially if you're still in the thick of recovering from what a narcissist put you through. But it's a question worth asking anyway, because the answer is genuinely more sobering and more instructive than the revenge fantasy most of us secretly want to hear. The question is simple. Where does it actually end for them? Not in the movies, not in the satisfying karmic ending you might have imagined during your worst nights. In reality, in the actual observable pattern that plays out again and again across relationships, across families, across careers. Where does a narcissist story actually go? Today, I want to walk you through the honest answer because it's not the dramatic downfall people fantasize about, and it's not the untouchable, thriving life they perform on social media either. It's something quieter, slower, and in a strange way, far more fitting than either extreme. Let's get into it. Let's start with a story. A man named Reggie built his entire adult life around being the most impressive person in every room he entered. Charismatic, quick-witted, endlessly confident, he moved through his 20s and 30s collecting admirers the way some people collect hobbies, casually, constantly, without much thought to sustainability. Friends came and went. Romantic partners came and went. Each one initially dazzled. Each one eventually worn down by the same underlying pattern of charm, followed by control, followed by discard. Business partners came and went too. Several of them burned in ways that left Reggie with a small but growing reputation problem in his professional circles. A problem he always managed to explain away with a compelling story about someone else's incompetence or betrayal. For years, from the outside, Reggie looked like he was winning. New job, new relationship, new city, new social circle, always seemingly one step ahead of the reputational damage trailing behind him, always finding a fresh audience before the old one caught up with what he actually was. If you'd asked anyone who knew him in his 30s whether Reggie would ever face any real consequences for the pattern of harm he left behind, most people would have said no, confidently, because that's simply not how it looked like his life was going to go. Here's where the story gets interesting, and here's the part that actually matters for understanding where this pattern tends to lead. By the time Reggie reached his 50s, something had quietly, gradually shifted, and it wasn't a single dramatic event. It was an accumulation. The pool of people willing to offer him a fresh start, a new job, a new relationship, a new friend group, had simply gotten smaller. Not because of one big public reckoning, no viral downfall, no dramatic confrontation where all his old victims gathered to expose him at once. Just a slow, steady narrowing, relationship by relationship, opportunity by opportunity, as more and more of the people in his orbit had either directly experienced the pattern themselves or heard enough secondhand accounts to approach him with caution rather than admiration. This is the actual, observable trajectory that shows up again and again when you study long-term outcomes for people with significant narcissistic patterns, and it's worth understanding clearly because it's so different from both fantasies we tend to entertain. It's not a dramatic collapse, and it's not an untouchable, permanently charmed life either. It's erosion, slow, cumulative, almost invisible in any single moment, but devastating in its long-term total. Each relationship that ends in discard or damage doesn't just disappear cleanly. It leaves a trace in that person's memory, in the stories they eventually tell others, in the caution they carry into their next interaction with someone who shares even a passing resemblance to the pattern they escaped. Over years, over decades, these traces accumulate into something that starts to genuinely constrain a narcissist's options, even if no single moment ever feels like the reckoning people fantasize about. Let's talk about why this erosion happens so reliably, because understanding the mechanism helps explain why it's not just wishful thinking. A narcissist's entire operating model depends on a continuous supply of fresh audiences, new people who haven't yet been burned, who don't yet carry the caution that comes from first-hand or second-hand experience with the pattern. Early in life, this supply feels essentially infinite. New schools, new jobs, new cities, new social circles, an endless stream of people meeting them for the first time, dazzled by the initial charm before the harder patterns have a chance to reveal themselves. But supply, even when it feels infinite, isn't actually infinite. Social circles overlap. Industries are smaller than they seem. Reputations travel, sometimes slowly, sometimes for years without consequence, but they do travel, especially in an era where people talk to each other more easily and more permanently than they ever have before. This is why the pattern so often shows up most visibly in midlife and beyond, rather than early on, when everything still looks like it's going fine. In your 20s, the pool of unburned people is still enormous. By your 40s and 50s, that pool has been meaningfully reduced by every relationship that ended badly along the way, and the search for fresh, unsuspecting audiences becomes progressively harder, often requiring increasingly desperate or increasingly narrow strategies. Younger and younger partners who haven't yet developed the pattern recognition that comes with more life experience, more geographically distant social circles, where the reputation hasn't traveled yet, more superficial relationships that never last long enough for the pattern to fully reveal itself before the narcissist moves on again. I want to be honest with you about something here because I don't want to oversell this into a simple, satisfying karma narrative that doesn't hold up under real scrutiny. This erosion is real, and it's well documented in longitudinal research on personality patterns and relationship outcomes. But it's also slow, often invisible from the outside, and it rarely produces the kind of dramatic, witnessed downfall that would feel emotionally satisfying if you're the one who was hurt. Reggie, even in his 50s, even with a meaningfully smaller circle of people willing to trust him, still had a life. Still had some relationships, however diminished in quality and number. Still, on the surface, seemed to be getting by. The erosion doesn't usually look like poverty, isolation, or obvious ruin, especially for narcissists with enough resources, charm, or social positioning to keep functioning even as their genuine connections thin out. What it actually looks like is something quieter, and in its own way more precisely fitting. A slow, permanent narrowing of genuine intimacy, replaced increasingly by shallow, transactional, or performative relationships that can never quite replace what was lost. This is the piece I really want you to sit with, because I think it's the honest, non-fantastical version of where they end up. And it matters, because it explains something that trips up a lot of people trying to make sense of a narcissist's trajectory after they've hurt them. A narcissist in their 60s or 70s, surrounded by people, isn't necessarily proof that the pattern didn't cost them anything. Look closer, and what you often find is a very specific kind of isolation. One that's easy to miss because it doesn't look like being alone in an empty house. It looks like being surrounded by people who don't actually know them, who've never been let close enough to see anything beyond the performance. Because every person who ever got close enough to see the real pattern eventually left. And the ones who remain are the ones who've learned to stay at a careful, protective distance, or the ones who simply haven't gotten close enough yet to see what's underneath. Let's talk about something specific that shows up with striking consistency in this pattern: the aging narcissist's relationship with their own history. Because here's something genuinely important to understand. The narrative management we talked about in a previous episode, the constant reframing, the recruitment of new witnesses, the careful curation of how past relationships get remembered, all of that requires enormous, ongoing energy to maintain. And energy, like everything else, becomes a scarcer resource with age. Younger narcissists often have the stamina to maintain elaborate, carefully managed versions of their own history across dozens of relationships and social circles simultaneously. Older narcissists, especially those who've burned through a significant portion of their available social capital, often find that the sheer number of competing, sometimes contradictory narratives they've constructed over decades becomes genuinely difficult to sustain, particularly as former partners, former friends, and former colleagues start comparing notes in ways that were much harder before social media, before group chats, before the world got smaller and gossip started traveling faster and further than it ever used to. This is worth understanding clearly, because it points towards something real and observable rather than a fantasy of dramatic downfall. Reputational fragmentation. The version of events a narcissist told their second wife doesn't always match the version they told their business partner, doesn't always match the version their adult children eventually piece together, doesn't always match what a former best friend remembers happening. For years, these fragmented, sometimes contradictory narratives can coexist without ever colliding, simply because the people holding them never had reason to compare notes. But time increases the odds of collision. Adult children eventually talk to their other parent. Old friends eventually reconnect and compare experiences. Former colleagues eventually run into each other at industry events and swap stories. And when these fragmented narratives finally do collide, even quietly, even without any dramatic public confrontation, something shifts permanently in how that person is understood by the people who matter most to them. I want to pause here and address something important, because I know if you're listening to this episode, there's a good chance you're doing so specifically because you're hoping for some kind of reassurance that the person who hurt you won't simply get away with it forever. And I don't want to give you a false, oversimplified promise, because that wouldn't be honest, and it wouldn't actually serve your healing in the long run. What I can tell you, based on genuinely observable, well-documented patterns, is this: the specific kind of deep, trusting, unguarded intimacy that most humans crave and need, the kind you can only build with people who've truly seen you and stayed anyway, becomes progressively harder for a narcissist to access as their pattern repeats across more and more relationships. Not impossible in every single case, but reliably harder, reliably rarer, reliably more elusive the longer the pattern continues without genuine change. So here's where we're headed as we move into the second half of this episode. I'm going to walk you through what this erosion actually looks like in specific detail across the different domains of a narcissist's life: romantic, professional, and familial, because the pattern shows up differently in each one, and understanding the specifics matters if you're trying to make peace with where someone who hurt you might actually be headed. I'm going to explain the specific, often overlooked role adult children play in this trajectory, because it's one of the most consistent and most painful patterns to witness. And I want to close with something important: why understanding this trajectory shouldn't become your reason for staying connected, waiting around, or hoping to witness it firsthand, because there's a real difference between finding peace in understanding where this pattern tends to lead and staying entangled in someone's life specifically to watch it happen. Stick with me, because the second half of this episode is where the most important distinction of all gets made. I'm going to walk you through what this erosion actually looks like in specific detail across the different domains of a narcissist's life: romantic, professional, and familial. Because the pattern shows up differently in each one, and understanding the specifics matters if you're trying to make peace with where someone who hurt you might actually be headed. Let's start with the romantic domain, because it's often the most visible and the most frequently misunderstood. Early on, a narcissist's romantic pattern often looks like abundance, a string of relationships, sometimes overlapping, sometimes ending and restarting quickly, always with someone new seemingly waiting in the wings. But watch this pattern over decades, not years, and something different emerges. The quality of partner tends to shift, often gradually, sometimes dramatically. Partners with more life experience, stronger support networks, and better developed pattern recognition become harder to attract and even harder to keep once the mask slips, because they've simply seen enough of the world to recognize the early warning signs faster than they once might have. What often remains, later in life, is a narrower pool: partners who are younger, more isolated, more financially or emotionally dependent, or otherwise less equipped to recognize or resist the pattern early. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't cruelty on the part of the narcissist choosing easier targets in some cartoonish, calculated way. It's simply the natural result of who remains available and willing once enough of the more resilient, more experienced people have already learned to recognize the pattern and root around it. The professional domain tells a similar story, though it moves on a slightly different timeline. Charisma and confidence, The tools that serve a narcissist so well early in a career often continue producing real results for years, sometimes decades, particularly in industries or roles where image and persuasion matter more than long-term collaborative trust. But most careers eventually require sustained collaboration, sustained trust, sustained relationships with colleagues who've had enough time to see past the initial performance. Reggie, whose story we followed through the first half of this episode, experienced exactly this. In his 30s, his charm opened door after door, new job after new job, always landing somewhere better before the accumulating pattern of burned colleagues and frustrated business partners caught up with him. By his 50s, that same charm still worked in first meetings, still won him a good first impression, but the opportunities requiring deeper trust, longer partnerships, or larger financial risk from other people who'd have time to actually know him had become measurably scarcer, replaced by shorter-term, more transactional professional relationships that never quite reached the scale of what he'd once been able to build. The familial domain is, in many ways, the most painful to witness, and it's the one I want to spend the most time on, because it's often the most overlooked in conversations about where this pattern leads. Adult children of narcissistic parents occupy a uniquely difficult position because, unlike a romantic partner or a business associate, they can't simply walk away with the same clean finality, at least not without enormous grief and complexity attached to that choice. What tends to happen over years and decades is a slow, often painful process of adult children gradually gaining enough distance, enough perspective, and enough of their own life experience to recognize patterns they couldn't fully see or name as children. This recognition rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces: a conversation with a therapist, a comment from a partner who notices something unsettling about how a parent treats them, a moment of watching that same parent interact with a grandchild in a way that suddenly, uncomfortably, mirrors an old memory. As this recognition deepens, the relationship often shifts, sometimes gradually into distance, sometimes into full estrangement, sometimes into something in between. A relationship maintained out of duty or complicated love, but held at a much more guarded, much more limited emotional distance than it once was. This is, statistically and anecdotally, one of the most consistent patterns observed in long-term outcomes for narcissistic parents. A slow, often quiet distancing from adult children, sometimes accompanied by equally quiet distancing from grandchildren, as the next generation, having witnessed the pattern play out with their own parent, makes different, more protective choices about how much access to grant. This is often the single most painful piece of the erosion because, unlike a discarded romantic partner or a burned colleague, the loss of closeness with one's own children and grandchildren tends to land somewhere a narcissist's usual defenses can't fully protect against, precisely because it touches something that even the most externally validated sense of self still, on some level, actually needs. Now, here's the distinction I promised you, and I think it's the most important part of this entire episode, so I want to be very careful and very clear about it. Understanding this trajectory, the erosion, the narrowing, the eventual isolation dressed up as busyness or superficial connection, is not a reason to stay entangled in someone's life, waiting to witness it. I've talked to too many people who, after learning about this pattern, start orienting their entire healing process around a kind of quiet vigil, checking in periodically, staying just connected enough to monitor whether the erosion is happening yet, whether karma, in whatever form it eventually takes, has started to arrive. I understand that impulse completely, and I want to gently, firmly redirect you away from it, because staying entangled specifically to witness someone's downfall keeps you every bit as tethered to their story as staying entangled to try to fix or change them ever did. It's simply a different flavor of the same unfinished business, and it costs you the same thing: presence in your own life, redirected toward monitoring someone else's. This distinction matters enormously, because there's a real difference between finding quiet, private peace in understanding that harmful patterns tend to have real, if slow, consequences, and needing to personally witness those consequences unfold in order to feel like justice was served. The first is compatible with genuinely moving on. The second keeps you in the audience of someone else's story indefinitely, waiting for a scene that might take decades to arrive, if it arrives in a form you'd even recognize as satisfying at all. Let's return to Reggie's story one final time, because there's a piece of it that illustrates this exact distinction. One of his former business partners, a man named Devon who'd been burned badly enough to lose a meaningful amount of money and nearly a decade of professional momentum, spent years, by his own admission, quietly tracking Reggie's career from a distance, waiting for the collapse he felt certain was coming. It never arrived the way Devon imagined it would. There was no public scandal, no dramatic bankruptcy, no viral downfall. Just the slow, unglamorous erosion we've been discussing. Smaller opportunities, thinner relationships, a life that looked, from a certain angle, perfectly fine, and from another angle, quietly, permanently diminished. Devon told me that the moment he actually found peace wasn't the moment he confirmed Reggie's life had gotten smaller. It was the moment he stopped checking. The vigil itself, he realized, years into maintaining it, had been costing him something Reggie's actual downfall, however slow or real, was never going to give back. This is the truth I want to leave you with today, and I think it's more honest and ultimately more useful than the revenge fantasy so much content on this topic tends to promise. Narcissists do, reliably over time, experience a kind of consequence for the pattern they repeat. Not a dramatic, cinematic downfall, but a slow, cumulative narrowing of genuine intimacy, trust, and connection that quietly shapes the back half of their lives in ways their earlier decades never suggested was coming. That's real, and it's worth understanding, if only because it can offer a certain quiet peace to know that the pattern doesn't simply run consequence-free forever. But that understanding was never meant to become a replacement destination for your own healing. It was meant to be a footnote, glimpsed once, maybe twice, and then set down so you could go on living a life that doesn't require their story to resolve in order for yours to feel complete. Picture this, one last time. Somewhere decades from now, in a life surrounded by people who never quite got close enough to see the whole picture, someone sits in a room full of acquaintances, professional contacts, distant relatives who visit out of obligation more than warmth, and feels, in a moment they'd never admit to anyone, the particular hollowness of being known by no one in that room. Not really, not fully, not the way people are known by the ones who've stayed close enough, long enough to see everything and choose to remain anyway. And somewhere else, in a life built entirely apart from that room, you're not thinking about it at all. You're surrounded by people who do know you, fully, imperfectly, genuinely, the way only people who've earned real closeness ever do. You didn't wait around to witness the erosion. You simply built something the erosion could never touch, because it was never in the same room to begin with. The final scene doesn't show a downfall. It shows two entirely separate lives, moving further and further apart with each passing year. One growing quietly smaller in all the ways that matter most, the other growing wider, fuller, and entirely permanently free. The distance between them the only ending this story was ever going to need.